One of the things that we're getting from this afternoon's conference. This morning conference was about the energy crisis, the price of oil. The afternoon conference, which started about 4 o'clock, 4:30. They were talking about one of the American delegates. I wasn't told who exactly it was talking about the the concern that the American citizens have had with the housing prices going down. So they're not investing that money. So what they needed to do is they needed to create the illusion that everything is going well. So what they're going to do over the next year and a half is to bring the market back up to 1998, 1999 levels. They're going to get all the suckers to invest whatever little money they have left over, and that's when they're going to make the economy bottom drop out. They need to destroy the economy because as we're running out of oil, when people don't travel, at least that's what they're saying, when people don't travel, when people don't have money, they don't travel, they don't spend any money, which means you don't waste a lot of oil and natural gas. That's actually the two people who are members of the Bilderberg Club.
It's actual members that are.
They're members of the Bilderberg Club who for years and years and years have been going and participating in all the conversations. They've always been dead on, always. And last year they said the oil prices are going to go up to 150. At the time it was 39, it went up to 76, basically doubled. If it doubles again, it's going to be back to where these people.
If they attack Iran, it will at 150.
Well, the Iran thing is on the back burner. It was very much on the agenda last year, but from what I'm getting at this year's today's lunch, and a few people playing golf, the Iran is definitely sour, and they're not exactly sure how to do this thing. There's just too many consequences, too many repercussions. Anyway,
but they told them no. I mean, they said don't attack Iraq. Half of them back in.
Well, I think it's different. I think the neocons. I think the Bush administration is not in the same position as they were 2, 3, 4 years ago, as they are now. So the whole point is that
28% approval rating. Yeah.
We still have 2 days of Bilderberg conference because it started late, a day late. It's going to go until Sunday afternoon. I think it's going to go Sunday morning. Still going to have discussing something. Anyway, it's on all day tomorrow. So we'll find out a lot more about what they're going to be talking about tomorrow. The first item on the agenda is Eurasia, Russia, China, and the relation that the Russians and the Chinese have with the Americans. That's the first item on the agenda first thing in the morning, and that's that discussion forum will be led by Richard Colonel.
The New World Order, as we're seeing it evolve, is exactly the opposite of what our founding fathers intended by developing the Constitution, the tripart form of government where you have division of powers between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. When our founding fathers established the Constitution of the United States, they intended to have the local government as being the superior government over the state government and the federal government. Unfortunately, over the last 50 years, the reverse has occurred. Now we have an all-powerful federal government. Jefferson said when that happens, we will have a tyranny that is far worse than the one that they had just separated, which was, of course, England. We now have a government basically that is a tyrannical form of government in the federal government. It will become more so in the future because they have no accountability to the actual local person. The reason why we had local government as being the most powerful government in our Constitution was the fact that these were people that were being elected by the people over which they had jurisdiction. Now we have jurisdiction by bureaucracy at the federal level that has no accountability whatsoever to the local person. And that will always result in tyranny eventually.
Bilderberg's ultimate goal is a world government for the United Nations to evolve into a world government, and they're making progress, and we must stop that progress. The fact that the UN is now the standing army of, the NATO is now the standing army of the United Nations that was established at the 50th anniversary celebration of NATO, pending before the UN for at least 3 years now, is legislation to impose a direct tax on all the people on Earth, their favorite being a 10-cent tax on barrel of oil head, but it was established the president of the UN directly taxing individuals throughout the world. And of course, the American Union, the NATO is to expand throughout the Western Hemisphere, evolve into the American Union. The dollar will be the euro, and already the groundwork is being laid for the Asian Pacific Union. The goal is to divide the world into 3 great regions for the administrative convenience of a world government, which the UN will become in our lifetime unless we win this fight.
I think that their plans are not coming together as quickly as they would have liked and would have hoped. For example, their idea for breakup of Canada, the initial plan was for 1996. We stopped them because we found out what their plan was. That was in King City and Toronto. Hundreds of thousands of people came out onto the street protesting the possible breakup. So these people postponed their plans to the year 2000. Now they have postponed them to the year 2007. The United States and Canada more or less are one nation now because you have the military code sharing. So the United States and Canadian military basically are working on the same wavelength.
Congress has already been signing its authority over to international bodies, and the World Trade Organization already has more authority over our trade disputes than our own Congress. Can you speak to that? It's already happening.
Well, yes, the WTO has ordered Congress to change some of the trade laws, and Congress comes running back like a pitiful child and follows orders. And I forgot exactly what the deal was, something to do with tariffs or something. But because we're part of the World Trade Organization, they, in effect, nullified the laws of Congress. Saying you got to change that law.
We are adapting our Supreme Court, our Constitution, to fit within this legal model of the world. We are being homogenized into the world. Our military is being homogenized and standardized into the world format. Everything that's happening through NATO and all the rest. NATO is the military branch of the European Union. We're going to have one here for the North American Union to enforce our borders, supposedly. The ASEAN, or the new Asian Union, will have another, and so forth. This is going to be, within a couple of years, it looks like, standardized all around the world.
If you really look at the world, up until the Renaissance, what you had basically had the feudal society with the slaves and the slave owners. Then suddenly with the Renaissance, the ideals of Socrates, the ideals of Solon took forth. And if we kind of jump forward to the reign of Louis the 11th and the Henry the 7th in England, these people, for the first time in the history of mankind, the ideals of nation state, which defines the United States, the idea of the government working for the people, not people working for the government, the idea of the social good, of greater good for humanity, came about. And if we jump to the 1760s, in Europe, the European intelligentsia, the people like Bailly and Lafayette, they realized that to destroy, the old world order, to destroy the European monarchy, what they needed to do, they needed to create a state. And that's what the idea of the United States came from. This Eden on earth of a nation where every man and woman were created equal. You had the freedom of speech, where you had for the first time in the history of mankind the ideal of nation state, of people, of governments working for the people, and not people working for the governments. And so these people like Lafayette and Bailly and other European intellectuals and thinkers, they've built themselves around the figure of Benjamin Franklin in the United States. And through this man, the idea was to create the Constitution of the United States and then import that Constitution back into Europe and use that Constitution to destroy the old world order, which was basically the old order led by the royalty of European nations. Now, the British East Indian Company, led at the time by Lord Shelburne, who was basically the treasurer of the royal family, and the man who ran the Committee of 300, the Council of 300 was called at the time, realized that they were looking at a very, very grave crisis. So what they wanted to do, what they needed to do, they needed to destroy the idea of the United States as a nation. That's where the idea of the American Revolution came about. Now, thankfully, the Committee of the Council of 300, they lost that revolution. But what they tried to do, and they were able to succeed, is they by forcing the French Revolution, they destroyed the concept of nation state. And we had to wait until after the Napoleon III, and then we had to jump to the age of the Fifth Republic of de Gaulle until we finally saw that nation state building that the United States was built on. Now, what they've done, the Jacobean Terror, 1789, 1794, the French Revolution, that was the concept of terror created by the Council of 300, the same Council of 300 which today lives on in the body of the Bilderbergers. Now the ideal hasn't changed. They're still pursuing the same goal, the goal to destroy humanity, to create the Nietzschean man beast. And again, the Jacobean terror, the siege of Bastille, which basically a terrorist act, that's what it was. There was very little difference. In my conferences, I always talk about, if you want to understand 11th of September, you need to understand the French Revolution. What happened in Bastille is the same thing that happened on 11th September. The concept of man beast, the concept of terror for terror's sake, the idea of Napoleon, which is one of the things that people do not understand. Napoleon worked basically for the British government. He was the agent, not literally an agent, but because of Napoleon's terror, destruction for destruction's sake, the man destroyed all of Europe and debilitated the Europe. And as a result, the only superpower left standing was Great Britain, controlled by Council of 300, which were the forerunners to today's Bilderbergers. Well, the idea of world government, again, in the future world order, when you have slaves and slave owners, you don't need a population base of 6 billion people, because these people need to eat, otherwise they die. So you might as well just get rid of half of the population base. And again, we saw that in 1974 report, which was leaked years ago, the 9th of April, 1974, report signed by Henry Kissinger in the last dying months of Nixon's administration, when they were talking about reducing the population base by 3 billion people. It's on page 9 of that report. I think it's point 29C. They're looking at ways, again, they're looking at ways scientifically how to reduce the population base. And what is so terrifying about that document is they're using graphs, line charts, pie charts to talk about killing it's genocide, that's what it is, killing 3 billion people using graphs and pie charts. And if you jump to today and you see what is going on today, it's very easy to understand that what they were talking about in 74 is coming around today. In the very near future, if we're paying right now $75, $76 a barrel, and in the near future we're paying $150, $200 a barrel, what's going to happen is to transport apples from point A to point B is going to cost an exorbitant amount of money, which means that poor people will not be able to pay $50 per apple and they will die. And the same will happen to people who live in Canada, who live in Scandinavian nations. Anywhere there is, you have this terror, you have to overcome these 40, 50 degree below zero winters. They'll just die because they will not have heat to heat their homes. So the Bilderbergers don't physically need to eliminate 3 billion people by putting a gun to their head. They can do it in a very, very subtle way, again, using the population control. And we're seeing it right now as oil goes up, as the food quality goes down. The age of the $10,000 Caesar salads, or $10,000 kiwis, or 10,000 kilometers, kiwis that travel from New Zealand, then they get packaged in Norway, then they're sent to Spain, and then finally get to the United States where they're sold, in Loblaws, are over. If you want to eat kiwis, you better grow them themselves. If you want to eat bananas, you better grow them themselves. I think the future of humanity is based, the survival of humanity is going to be based on our ability to live in much smaller community. If not, unfortunately, we're playing into the hands of the Bilderbergers and the world elite.
One of the things that we need to recognize in infrastructure is what causes the economy to grow. Yes, we need private property rights. Yes, we need a good economy. But the economy is also dependent upon our transportation system of being able to get products from one area to another. The whole Agenda 21 concept compartmentalizes that economy. In other words, they environmentalists want us to be able to grow and produce everything that the local region needs. We won't need it. They do not want us to have this transportation. They do not want us to have the ability to draw tomatoes from South America into the United States. They want us to, if we cannot produce it in the United States during the middle of winter, then we shouldn't have it. If we cannot produce it in your local community, then we shouldn't have it. This is all part of their vision, their view of sustainable development. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's the way they elected to do it. Why? Because they believe, one, that nature is God, and that two, they want to have control. The more they can control, the better they can be able to accomplish what they want in our lives. One of the things that most people do not understand is most of the environmental laws that we have created over the last 40 years have come from a very small group of people through what is known as the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. This itself has been created and funded and sponsored by principals like Prince Philip or Prince Charles, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation. If you think back, not very many years ago, if you talked about the Bilderbergers, if you try to talk about the Trilateral Commission or the Club of Rome, you would be called some sort of conspiracist nut. Those organizations, we were told, did not exist. It certainly did not have an agenda that we claimed that they had. Now it's all out in the open. They will lie and they will conspire to keep the truth from the people until they no longer can, and then they'll paint it as just something that's normal. But think about it. Think just a moment about it. You have 135 people roughly in the Bilderbergers. You have about 175 in the Trilateral Commission. These people are making policy decisions for every single human being on planet Earth. Somewhere less than 500 people if you look at it in total, maybe 1,000, doesn't matter. These people are making decisions for the entire world. Do you really want that? One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that this concept of regionalization has been around for a long time. In 1973, the Club of Rome actually published a diagram showing that they wanted to divide the world up into 10 different regions, financial regions. They called them actually financial kingdoms, in which each kingdom would have its own separate economic integrity, so that they would be able to carry forth the types of supervision, the types of economic flow and so forth that is necessary to stabilize what is going on in the world and provide the mechanism, the structure, architectural structure to begin the population reduction that they've always been wanting to promote. In order to achieve their idea of world government, or global governance as they now call it, they wanted to actually divide the world up into 10 economic regions. They called them 10 kingdoms, but that was kind of a language that just didn't fit very well within the psyche of the American people and Europeans at the time, so they changed it to financial regions, and that's what it's been called ever since. It's one of the issues in which all of the member organizations of this effort, of the Anglo-American faction, have been working on. The Trilateral Commission, the Club of Rome, the Bilderbergers, the CFR, and so forth have all been working on this. And here you can see the diagram of how they envisioned it back in 1973. When it came out in 1995, our global neighborhood was the United Nations Commission on Global Governance. This is where they begin to finally put it together in the form of a document. This document has been the actual template they've been using ever since 1995. If you look at what's actually going on, what they called regional groups, not only are this 500 or 1,000 people actually developing the policy for the world, they're developing policy that benefits them, not us. I worked closely with the EPA and the U.S. Forest Service and many environmental organizations, and it became very obvious to me that they really weren't interested in protecting the environment. They were interested in advancing an agenda. And so I began to do research as to what it is that was motivating them and where they were going. And I was shocked to realize that at least in the leadership, both of our government and the non-governmental organizations that were involved in this, were what's called pantheists, the belief that nature is God. And therefore their role was not in serving the American people, but in protecting nature from the American people. It was actually 100 years ago with Muir in starting the Sierra Club and so forth. And he, again, was a pantheist, that believed that nature is God. I won't go into that particular aspect of it, but he truly believed that we need to set vast acreages of land aside for the principal purpose of allowing nature to go her own way, because in essence, nature is the foundation of all life, and therefore we must protect it at all costs. It actually languished for about 100 years until not 100, about 60 or 70 years until the 1960s with the advent of the New Age movement and the counterculture movement. And then it began to take on some real power.
Which thought it was counterculture, but really foundation funded the whole time.
That's right. The whole counterculture movement was orchestrated and funded not only by the foundations, but was inspired by a pantheistic belief system, a cult religious belief system, whose origins are found in theosophy, or the belief that nature is God, and taken through what is now known as Lucifer Trust, which is the organization for the elite to implement their ideas, headed up by Alice Bailey in the first half of the 20th century. The whole global warming issue is a farce. It's a sham, basically, to advance this agenda and create a condition in which the United States, the citizenry of the United States, is going to be willing to give up our sovereignty in order to control what they perceive as a doomsday scenario, that if they don't get a handle on it within the next 10 years, that's what we've been hearing now. Actually, if you remember back in the early 1990s, they said we had 10 years to do it or we're doomed. Well, now it's been 15 years ago now, and of course nothing's changed. Well, the same thing is going on right now. Global warming is occurring, don't get me wrong, but it's not caused by man. We had what was called a little ice age back in the 1700s and 1800s, and during that period of time we were able to, there's a high correlation between sunspot activity and the energy output of the sun. There were almost no solar flares, no sunspots during the 17 and early 1800s. And it got about a degree and a half colder than it is right now. It is very interesting that the solar radiation and the Earth's temperature are highly correlated. In fact, they can actually be almost on a daily coordination. We had a major solar eruption back in 1998 at the same time as we had El Nino, and we had a solar spike within a week, a temperature increase within a week of that event that peaked out within a few days, about a week or so, and this is global. This isn't just the United States or a local regional area. This was global. And the two in combination, the El Nino and a solar spike in which we had a major solar eruption that was pointed right at Earth, actually changed the Earth's temperature right away. And if you go back into the 1700s, you can actually see the correlation between the Earth's temperature and the emissions of radiant energy by the sun.
One of the ironies, I think, of our times is the fact that during the 1960s and so forth, they begin to have a dogma that the environment is being destroyed by human beings. And this was perpetrated or spread out through the media. You can't watch any nature program on chimpanzees, whales, it doesn't really matter, without coming away from the fact that human beings are a virus. We're killing planet Earth, according to this media hype that we've had ever since the 1960s. Now it's global warming. You can't hardly go through a week without hearing some scare story about global warming, that if we don't stop it in the next few years, the Earth is going to boil up and blow away, even though that there's been times in history where it's been much warmer than it is today, and of course, obviously, times in history where it's been much colder. None of these things, really by themselves, really are caused necessarily by human activity. It's a natural cycle. We can destroy the environment. We can destroy ecosystems, but now we have the incentive to maintain ecosystems, to manage ecosystems, but that's not good enough. We can actually manage ecosystems better than nature can herself. We can make ecosystems healthier, but that's not an alternative. Their alternative is that you have no use. That's the only solution that they have for protecting the environment, is you cannot use it. You cannot use it. You must protect it. You must put it in the form of wilderness, whatever the case might be. Well, nonetheless, we cannot use it. Humans are the cause of the problem.
We have many people in our university systems right now, PhDs and so forth, that really believe that we must reduce our human population by 70, 80, even 90% in order to protect Mother Earth. Many of these people actually believe that there should be wholesale slaughter of human beings in one form or another, either through disease or actual government programs of some sort or another. The actual Wildlands Project itself that I fought back in the 1990s calls for a reduction in human population of 80% in the next 50 years. They don't say how to get there, although they do make it very clear that they would probably do it through agricultural means. They really truly believe that if fertilizers and so forth cause ecological destruction, because they believe that, then we must reduce the use of fertilizers, and it's fertilizers and genetic improvement and so forth that have caused the green revolution that fed the world from the 1960s on. If we eliminate that, we'll only have food production enough for about a third of the global population that we have today. That would eliminate the population within one generation. One of the things that Carroll Quigley, one of the foremost historians of the 20th century, said after going through all the documentations of the global elite for at least 2 years, said in his book, Tragedy and Hope, towards the end of the 20th century, the expert will replace the democratic voter in control of the political system. This is because planning will inevitably replace laissez-faire in the relationship between government and business. This planning may not be single or unified, but it will be planning in which the main framework and operational forces of the economic system will be established and limited by the experts on the governmental side, and then the experts on the economic side will do their planning within these established limits. And so what Carroll Quigley is saying is that by the 21st century, we are going to be living in a planned society controlled by the experts. Now, look back, now that we're in the 21st century, has not that occurred? It has, just as he said was going to happen. But of course, he had access to the records of what they were intending to do. But it actually gets worse. Back in 1965, the Department of Health and Education and Welfare, HEW, sponsored a study
to define how they're going to get from where they were then in 1965 to where we are now in the 21st century. They came out with a report in 1969 called the Behavioral Science Teacher Education Program that's now fully integrated within our educational program. And this is what they said, and I want to have you hang on to your hats because you will not believe what they planned to do back in 1965-69 and what is happening actually today. He said calculations of the future and how to modify it are no longer considered to be an obscure academic pursuit. Long-range planning and implementation of plans will be made by a technological scientific elite. This will strain the democratic fabric to the ripping point. The Protestant ethic will atrophy as more and more enjoyed a varied, leisured, and guaranteed sustenance. Work as a means to, and an end of living will diminish. Most people will tend to be hedonistic, and a dominant elite will provide the bread and circuses to keep social dissension and disruption at a minimum. A small elite will carry society's burdens. The resulting impersonal manipulation of most people's lifestyles will be softened by provision for pleasure-seeking and guaranteed physical necessities. The controlling elite will engage in power plays largely without the involvement of most of the people. And that is so true today. Most people have no idea what's going on in the international arena, have none. Almost all of this is being done in secrecy. Going on with this report, the society will be a leisurely one. People will study, play, and travel. Some will be in various stages of the drug-induced experiences. Each individual will receive at birth a multi-purpose identification which will have, amongst other things, extensive communications and control uses. Each individual will be saturated with ideas of information. Each will be self-selected. Other kinds will be imposed overtly by those who assume the responsibility for the other's actions. Relatively few individuals will be able to maintain control over their opinions. Most will be pawns of competing opinion molders. It's amazing how back in the 1960s they began the process of getting us to where we are right now. If you look at society today, almost every one of the characteristics that I read have come true. We are living in a planned society. We are living focused on leisure and recreation. We live in a drug-induced society. All of the things that they talked about in the 1960s have become a reality by the 21st century. This is the level of extent of control that they have. Most people's opinions are not done through education and through knowledge. They're done by molding your ideas. And that's why it's very hard for the average person to understand the fact that we're moving into a global society that is totally controlled by puppeteers, the global elite. And moving towards their ultimate objective of having world government, they have created various crises along the way over the last 100 years. World War I, as we've talked about, was contrived. World War II was contrived. We got the United Nations as a result of World War II, which was one of their big goals. Even though they denied the fact that they ever intended to have the United Nations as a world government, some of their more esoteric documents show very clearly that that's what they intended right from the start. And we're starting to see that now with the Commission on Global Governance. All the international treaties that we're looking at, especially the environmental treaties, basically are like these strands over Gulliver and Gulliver's Travels. One strand does not necessarily trap us, but when you have hundreds of these international treaties and all of these regulations, when you have the North American Union where you give up your basic sovereignty to a group of international bureaucrats, all of these things are strands that literally tie us down to the point that we no longer have freedom to cause development. We no longer have economic freedom. We no longer have a free market enterprise. We no longer have the ability to profit from innovation, and that will ultimately destroy us. Now that we no longer have war to maintain stability within the population and maintain control, which is kings and queens and bureaucrats and tyrants and so forth through history have used war, we have to have an alternative form of terror in order to maintain the stability of people and the allegiance of people behind their government. That is now taking the form of terrorism. It's a perfect recipe. Back in 1967, there was a report called the Iron Martin Report that was released, calling for environmental holocaust and so forth to accomplish the same thing. That worked to a point, but it did not take them where they fully wanted to go. And they now have this mechanism of always the constant fear of terrorist attack to keep us off our feet, to keep us willing to give up our freedoms in order to gain peace and security. Carroll Quigley, in his book Tragedy and Hope, basically said they were willing to work with communists, they're willing to work with fascists, they're willing to work with any of these isms or whatever, because those groups control their population, and they want to control the population. So they're more than willing to work with those groups. They say they're capitalists, but understand their form of capitalism is nothing more than controlled economies. It's not true free markets. It's not even true capitalism. It's capitalism only to a certain percentage of the population that are part of the global elite or part of the upper crust. In many ways, it's either crony capitalism or a monopoly, because those are the people, those people that rise to the top, and there are not going to be very many of them, that benefit from this fascist form of government.